Spoiler on this week's show. These two assholes are fucking, all they do is put up their sign.
The fuck?
Spoiler for this week's podcast. Rocky opens his mouth really wide, and he's really good at it. Look at him. It's so big. Spoiler for this week's podcast.
I can't talk right now. I'm trying to do a podcast.
Come on, get off the phone. Spoiler on this week's podcast. Goldberg sticks his tongue out, and ow, and he punches. Spoiler for this week's podcast. Dennis Book. Dennis Stamp. Booked. Spoiler for this week's podcast. Flash Lanigan has Star Wars and Cubs.
2015, my ass.
Spoiler for this week's podcast. Michael Tarver eats so many Mentos that his teeth go rotten. Spoiler for this week's show. Thrasher's going to keep his head like that? What's under that dress under there? Let me see your dick. Spoiler for this week's podcast. Hot Rod chews bubblegum and takes names. Spoiler for this week's podcast. Hot Rod really wants to choke me really bad. Please don't. Please. Come on. We're doing a podcast, all right? All right. Spoiler for this week's podcast. Scott Norton and I arm wrestle, and he murders me. Spoiler for this week's podcast. Kevin Sullivan's growing a beard, and we'll talk about it. He looks like Santa, kind of. Yeah. Spoiler on this week's podcast. Disco Inferno dances.
Not good.
No, it's shit. No. Spoiler for this week's podcast. Oh, she's flicking off, and it's the reddest hair of all time. All right, this week on the podcast, Brian Myers, Kurt Hawkins.
Which one?
I don't know. This week on the podcast, the Darewolf is eating a protein cookie. He's fucking crazy. Tommy N on the podcast this week. He teaches me Dutch. Teach me something quick.
Thank you all.
Oh, dank you wel means thank you. Thanks. This week on the podcast, James Mason is British and proper. Hey, buddy.
Hey, mate.
That's pretty proper. This week's podcast, Lance Hoyt pops and locks. Give me some moves. Oh my God, he's doing it. Gulak on the show.
Hi.
Rhymes with attack.
Yes, it does.
Also rhymes with butt sack.
Hey!
Or ball sack. The legend of Truth Martini and the border comes to truth on this week's podcast. Double J on the podcast this week. Hi. It's been 3.5 years in the making. Slap nuts. Magnus, Nick Aldis on the show. Body for Superstars is his book.
Body for Superstar. The Superstar Body.
Shit.
We just discussed.
Hacksaw's on the show this week. I
got something to say, too!
Oh? Taz is on the podcast this week, and he suplexes the shit out of me. It hurt really bad. This week on the show, Gary Michael Cabana.
Yes.
Eugene's on the podcast, and we kind of look alike.
A little bit.
We can be brothers. Colt Dinsmore. Bob Holly's on the podcast this week. 24/7 Hardcore Championship on the line right now. Jinder Mahal gets into my screen and does the podcast this week. Thanks.
Check it out. Shukriya.
Cheerleader Melissa on the podcast this week. She's a real life cheerleader.
Yay.
Snitsky's on this week, and look at that fucking beard.
It's not my fault.
Or beard. This week on the podcast, Bobby Roode.
Duh.
No. Scorpio on the podcast this week. What'd it do?
Woody woo, what'd you do?
See, I'm hip. Boogie Woogie is on the podcast this week.
Whoo, Messi, hey, y'all, I'm going to tell my people, all my brothers and sisters, don't you
This week on the podcast, Abyss has a nice smile.
Thanks, Colt.
Yeah, you're welcome. Squire Dave Taylor is on the show this week.
Yes, I am!
Jesus, that was very loud. He's cool. Danny Moff is on the show this week, and he smells so... Can you smell him from here? Smell him. Oh, it smells so... Hey, Vampiro's on the podcast this week.
Don't miss it.
Well, don't miss those tattoos. This week, Kevin Matthews is on the show.
Is Vine still a thing?
I'm holding on to it. I don't know. Oh. Jack Evans is on the show this week.
The one and only.
I can't believe he did that. Should I do one right now?
Yeah.
You think Jay Lethal's on this week's podcast? Jimmy Hart.
Stay on him, Honky. That's the way, baby. Get him, baby. Yeah, you got this, baby.
Tony Mamaluke is on the podcast this week. And I'm Jewish. Can I do it?
Happy on.
Missy Hyatt's on the show, and she has a piece of paper with all her questions.
Yes, I do.
Enjoy. Big Damo's on the podcast, and his beard is like his name.
Big and bushy.
Virgil and I podcast, we don't go to Olive Garden. Are you mad?
No, I want to go to Olive Garden.
Sorry. Johnny Devine on the podcast this week. Johnny, who's my uncle?
Bob's your uncle.
I have no clue, but apparently he is.
Bob's your uncle.
C.W. Anderson is on the podcast this week, has no shirt on. Does he have pants on?
You never know.
Spoiler alert. This week on the podcast, the mustache of Silas Young. The last real man. Conan does the podcast this week, and I fuck a Yeti.
Wow.
I mean, no. Spud's on the podcast this week. He's got a Swayze shirt on.
Swayze's the man.
Is he, though?
Roadhouse.
Terry Funk.
Roadhouse.
Terry Funk. Savio Vega is on the podcast.
En la casa, tío Savio Vega garantiza tu derrota. Boricua, who?
Teddy Hart on the show this week, and he may or may not be smoking a blunt.
I'm still smoking a blunt.
He is.
And I love
Guido's on the show this week, and he teaches me how to do this.
Do this.
I'm pretty good, right?
Do this.
Yeah. Congo Kong on the show this week, and he doesn't say anything the whole time. It's a weird podcast. I'm sorry. Jimmy Havoc is on the podcast this week.
Hello. Good. Thanks for having me, Colt. When did you pay me?
RJ City's on the podcast this week, and he just wants to do Don Knotts impersonations.
Hiya, Colt.
It's that for the whole thing. Jim Brunzell's on the show, and he does not drop kick me. Thank you for not drop kicking me.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Ethan Page is on the show this week. He seems really scared. Oh, now he's not scared. Oh, he's scared. Got him. Luther Ward's on the show this week from Ireland.
Top of the morning to ya.
Oh, that's so typical. Terry Funk's on the podcast. He's only got 6 seconds.
6 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hanson's on the show. He's a person, but more importantly, his beard.
Yeah, more beard.
Cedric Alexander's on the show wearing the nerdiest shit of all time.
It's awesome.
Show him your sweatpants. Show him your sweatpants. Kenny King on the show this week, and he's an angel. Look at that light.
He thinks Goku's a Pokemon. Who trains these guys?
Trevor Murdoch's on the show this week. Had a dip in the whole time.
I did. It's right there.
Look at that fucking thing.
That's a great.
Scott D'Amore's on the show this week. He's so Canadian.
Yes!
Adam Rose on the podcast. Aldous Rose on the podcast. He's constantly in the sun, dodging it.
Avoiding.
Billy Gunn's on the podcast this week, and he shows me his ass the whole time.
Yeah.
'Cause-
No.
No, you're not.
Boom, boom, Colt Cabana. Boom, boom, Colt Cabana. Boom, boom, Colt Cabana. It's Colt Cabana.